In this podcast episode, economist Steve Keen, renowned for predicting the 2008 financial crisis, provides a deep and nuanced analysis of modern economic challenges. He addresses America's over-privatization, the complex balance of capitalism and socialism as exemplified by China, the role of private debt and banking in economic cycles, the limitations and misunderstandings of mainstream economics, the nature of technological innovation and financial bubbles, and untangles the often misunderstood ideas of Karl Marx. He also discusses the fragility of Western economies, the influence of politics and campaign financing, and the systemic issues shaping both the U.S. and global economies. Steve Keen contends that America has gone too far in privatizing essential sectors, including the political process. He argues that election campaigns should be financed entirely by government funds, banning private donations to prevent undue influence and corruption. According to him, the current system, where politicians are effectively bought by private interests, produces detrimental outcomes and erodes democratic integrity. This critique connects to a broader concern about the erosion of public accountability and the dominance of private interests in public policy. China is presented as an intriguing model that combines capitalist competition with socialist state control, especially in long-term strategic sectors. Keen highlights China's engineering-driven industrialization as a deliberate approach to reviving and expanding manufacturing, contrasting this with the West's deindustrialization and over-reliance on services, primarily financial services. The rapid per capita income growth in China, averaging about 8% per year, starkly contrasts with the much slower growth in Western countries, leading to an exponential divergence in economic power. China's large state investment in infrastructure and manufacturing, paired with competitive dynamism at the provincial level, exemplifies a pragmatic yin and yang between socialism and capitalism, rather than a strict ideological adherence to either. Keen reflects critically on globalization's impact, emphasizing that it disempowered workers in developed nations by offshoring manufacturing to countries like China, which benefited from industrial growth and technological transfer. He describes globalization as a flawed experiment predicated on the idea that services would be the future, while manufacturing would be outsourced to cheap labor markets. However, the service sector growth was mainly financialization, which later culminated in crises like the 2007-2008 financial crash. This shift hollowed out domestic industries, weakened labor's bargaining power, and created systemic vulnerabilities. Central to Keen's economic theory is the role of private debt, which he argues is a major driver of economic booms and busts and is frequently misunderstood by mainstream economics. Unlike the conventional textbook view of banks as intermediaries, Keen stresses that banks create money ex nihilo when issuing loans, thereby increasing aggregate demand. This creation of money debt fuels economic expansions, but when private debt accumulation becomes unsustainable, its contraction leads to busts, recessions, and declining worker shares of GDP. Keen's mathematical modeling reveals that rising private debt correlates strongly with falling wage shares, meaning workers receive less income even as debt increases. This dynamic fuels wealth inequality and destabilizes the economy. The repeated cycles of borrowing during booms and repayment during slumps act like a ratchet, pushing private debt to ever higher levels, which lowers workers' relative income and overall economic stability. Keen sharply criticizes the neoclassical economic view, which largely ignores the role of private debt and banking in money creation. He characterizes economics more as a religion than a science, as mainstream economists cling to dogmatic beliefs about banks merely acting as intermediaries and about equilibrium as the natural economic state. This orthodox approach fails to explain or predict crises such as the 2008 collapse because it neglects the endogenous money creation function of banks and the destabilizing role of excessive private credit. He cites leading economists and notable papers that reflect these misunderstandings, such as treating static debt-to-GDP ratios as evidence that credit expansion does not impact the economy, confusing debt levels with changes in debt, and therefore missing critical early warning signs of crisis. Keen calls for economics to incorporate the real-world empirical data about money and banking, moving away from simplistic, unrealistic textbook models. According to Keen's interpretation and extension of economic thought, capitalism inherently involves cyclical booms and busts driven primarily by investment levels. Investment in physical capital, building factories and machinery, fuels booms, while a withdrawal or decline in investment initiates slumps. Crucially, he distinguishes genuine investment from financial speculation, viewing the latter as unproductive or even parasitic. Investment decisions are governed by capitalists who borrow during booms, expecting profits, and repay debts during downturns, creating economic fluctuations and making cycles inevitable. The podcast delves into Joseph Schumpeter's theory of economic development, where innovation disturbs economic equilibrium, creating profit opportunities through technological advantages that upset existing markets. These innovation-driven booms are fueled by banking credit that finances entrepreneurial ventures, but result in busts when newer technologies supplant or disrupt older industries. Keen applies this framework to current trends such as the AI boom, noting massive overinvestment driven by speculative optimism. While such bubbles are natural to capitalism, the scale of AI investments is unprecedented, potentially sparking deep recessions when costs outpace revenues drastically. The social impact could be severe as automation and AI threaten to displace large segments of both clerical and blue-collar jobs, further challenging income distribution and aggregate demand. Keen contextualizes the distinction between socialism and communism, showing that Marx himself was primarily a critic of capitalism rather than a detailed architect of socialism. He explains that Marx's vision of communism was more an aspirational ideal than a practical blueprint. Much of what is labeled Marxism today is a distorted caricature of Marx's original thoughts. His reading of Marx reveals a more sophisticated analysis than popularly portrayed, particularly challenging the simplistic labor theory of value and the notion that machinery adds no value to production and profit. Keen found in Marx's early writings a recognition that all elements in production, labor and capital, contribute to surplus value, thereby undermining arguments about the inevitability of socialism. He also stresses that Marx's desire was to create a scientific socialism grounded in economic forces rather than utopian ideals, advocating reforms like universal education and healthcare, which align more with social democracy. Keen sharply criticizes modern Marxist movements, including those in the U.S., for misusing Marx's name while promoting authoritarian, centralized approaches incompatible with economic complexity and individual motivations. Keen looks at the historical failure of Soviet socialism, drawing on the work of economist Janos Kornai to argue that Soviet economies were supply-constrained, receiving insufficient investment across sectors, which stifled innovation and economic growth. This contrasts with capitalist economies that are demand-constrained, where firms continually innovate to capture market share, promoting growth and technological progress. China, in Keen's view, learned from these failures and developed a hybrid model where the state provides infrastructure and long-lived capital assets, facilitating competitive markets in consumer goods. This targeted approach balances planning and competition, distinguishing China from both Soviet-era socialism and Western capitalism. Keen laments the outsized influence of the financial sector in modern economies, which has transitioned from serving industrial production to driving speculative bubbles. He recalls Marx's term, roving cavaliers of credit, to describe financial actors who detach from real production, fueling asset price spikes in housing and stock markets. He elaborates on how margin debt amplifies stock market bubbles, with speculative borrowing increasing asset prices far beyond fundamentals. These bubbles inevitably burst, causing financial and economic crises as wealth evaporates, credit contracts, and employment declines. Keen insists that true investment creates productive capacity, factories, infrastructure, goods, whereas speculative activity merely redistributes pre-existing wealth without generating new value, destabilizing the economy. Keen rejects the mainstream obsession with economic equilibrium, emphasizing that real economies are complex, evolving systems characterized by constant change, innovation, competition, and conflict among heterogeneous actors. His dialectical and empirical approach seeks to capture this dynamism, contrasting sharply with static neoclassical models. He argues that economic theories and policies must embrace complexity and evolutionary processes to be relevant and effective. Contrary to mainstream fears of public debt, Keen asserts that government spending via deficit financing plays a crucial stabilizing role in cushioning economic downturns and preventing catastrophic debt deflations. Unlike private debt, which must be repaid and can trigger bankruptcies, government debt creation operates differently as governments can issue fiat currency. He explains that public debt issuance often does not increase money supply in net terms because government bonds are absorbed and resold within the financial sector, frequently neutralizing initial government-created money. Private sector credit expansions have been the dominant contributor to inflation and economic fluctuations. Thus, limiting the focus to government debt obscures the real issues. Keen stresses the need to properly balance public and private roles in the economy, recognizing that government provision of long-lived infrastructure, education, public health, and essential services constitutes indispensable support for market functions. Keen agrees that the Western economies, especially the U.S., are fragile due to the high levels of private debt and financialization. He predicts an imminent recession linked to the bursting of the AI investment bubble and underlying structural imbalances. This is exacerbated by political dysfunction and economic mismanagement, including ill-conceived government policies during recent crises such as COVID-19 stimulus. He disputes the conventional indicators linking government debt to GDP ratios over 130% to state collapse, stating instead that private sector credit crises drive economic crashes, with government debt rising thereafter as a response. Keen criticizes the American political system for its dependence on expensive private financing, which corrupts democratic processes. He sees a dire need for campaign finance reform to remove private money's influence and thereby improve the quality of political leadership. While appreciative of American constitutional checks and balances, he believes these have been compromised. He also contrasts this with China's more authoritarian yet technocratic governance, highlighting its pragmatic, education and engineering-based bureaucracy and performance-driven political promotion system. Although wary of authoritarian tendencies, he regards aspects of China's governance as effective in certain respects compared to Western dysfunction. The discussion touches on America's failures in public provision of education and healthcare, describing them as costly and inequitable due to excessive privatization and inadequate public standards. Keen compares this unfavorably to other advanced economies with more universal and merit-based systems, which produce better social outcomes and more equitable access. The privatization trend in these sectors contributes to inequality and social dissatisfaction. Finally, Keen shares his personal skepticism towards speculative finance, having consistently avoided financial bubbles and gambling on stocks. He places his faith in productive investment via business creation rather than financial speculation, a stance rooted in his understanding of the economy as a complex real-world system rather than a gambling casino. He advocates for a focus on genuine economic value creation rather than asset price speculation. Steve Keen mentions his ongoing work developing software called Ravel, designed to model the economy as a dynamic, non-equilibrium system using double-entry bookkeeping to integrate financial and real economic activities. This tool aims to provide a more accurate foundation for understanding economic complexities and informing better policy decisions, stepping beyond static neoclassical paradigms.